Clapper board. You're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled, They Claimed Deathworlders Were Myths, until the human cadet raised her hand. A short sci-fi story. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now we begin. The first alarm was the kind that barely anyone notices. One soft chime woven into the comfort of an ordinary morning. It trembled through the glass canopy of the Galactic Academy auditorium, whispered along silver beams, and was lost in the hum of 1,000 cadets taking their seats. Violin Prime wore a mantle of auroras that day, pale curtains of green and blue swaying across a high, thin atmosphere, and the world felt like a cathedral made for listening. In the center of that bright hush, Admiral Threx moved with the stillness of an old mountain. His carapace was hard as volcanic glass, fissured with lines from a lifetime of gravity and battle, and his eyes, two cut crystals, watched the room the way stars watch dusk. He lifted one claw to the holostage and woke an ancient war. Smoke unfurled. Oceans flashed with impossible storms. Across the curved dome, the image of a biped flickered into being. Soft skin, no claws, no plates, no armor. Its eyes gazed into a horizon full of weather. "The Deathworlders," Threx said, his voice a bell sounding across a cold valley. A legend told to frighten cadets into discipline and commanders into humility. Creatures alleged to have been forged by a world so cruel that iron would have chosen not to form. Most scholars consign them to myth. Some data shards mention a designation, Homo sapiens, a name without a body. A flutter of amusement rustled through the rings of seats. Cadets smiled with their mouths closed, polite and distant. They had seen this lecture. They liked its shape and its moral. They would take notes and afterward trade them for drinks and remember none of it until exam day. But the alarm, a second chime, threaded the glass again, sounded and was swallowed by the world. Threx paced. The holo pivoted through valleys and cities built against bad weather. "Consider what the myth demands," he said. "A planet of extremes, gravity slightly unkind, air half poisoned and half necessary, predators that run on muscle and stubbornness, a sun that remembers to burn too hot and too cold. The question is not whether such a species could exist." He paused, the crystals in his face angling toward the upper seats. "The question is whether it could survive long enough to matter." A hand rose from the last row, small in a sea of hands that did not rise. Threx turned slowly. "Cadet." The hand lowered. A young voice carried through the hush, steady and clear. "Permission to correct the record, sir." There were chuckles, quiet as breathing, sharp as knives. No one corrected an admiral. Threx's crystalline eyes focused. On what basis? The voice did not tremble. On memory. She stood and the room breathed in. She was not imposing, not strange. Hair dark and tied back, skin too thin for a radiation day. A seamstress's hands. Her name badge glowed faintly against navy cloth. Mira Holt. Threx held that name between his eyes for a moment. "Proceed, Cadet Holt. How does one correct mythology?" Her gaze stayed on him. "Not myth," she said softly, as if teaching him how to hold a word. "Species." A few cadets hissed air past their teeth. "Pretender," someone whispered. "Story grazer." Threx lifted a claw and the room's noise drained away. "Evidence." Mira Holt reached into the small satchel at her hip and lifted a thing that did not belong on Violin Prime. It was heavy for its size, dull with age, its metal chewed by time. "This is a relic from my family," she said. "A bullet. Our ancestors used them in weapons that worked by fire and pressure. We learned to throw metal fast enough to pierce bone and steel. It is crude. It is ugly. It exists." She held it as if it could still heat the air. Threx's gaze was a slow rotation of stars. "And you claim?" "I am human," she said. "One of a scattered few. Our cradle world is ash and myth, but our blood remembers weather." The auditorium made the sound that crowds make when they are embarrassed by a dare. Threx watched the room, then drew the holostage down with a gesture. The biped blinked out. The auroras beyond the glass seemed suddenly too beautiful to be real. "Cadet Holt," Threx said, each word measured like a stone placed in a river. "We will see your myth tested under conditions that do not care for stories." She nodded once. "Yes, sir." The third alarm, almost lost, rippled through the beams. Some cadets glanced up, then forced themselves to look away. The academy loved calm. It despised omens. They filed out into corridors smelling of sterilizers and polished metal, their boots ticking like rain on a long roof. By the time anyone found the source of the alarms, a static whisper from the dark between arms of the galaxy, something old and algorithmic turning its eye this way. Mira Holt was already in the simulation wing. The chamber was a world in a room, a machine with a hungry heart. It breathed environments, manufactured skies. Today's schedule read rescue extraction under hostile conditions. Teams formed without thinking and left their thinking behind, confident in ratings and devices. Mira's team took shape around a tall Zarveth whose scales looked like old frost on black stone. He measured Mira like a ration and shook his head. "You are soft," he hissed. "Stay in the pocket of our fire, do not stray." Mira's mouth made the shape of a polite smile and said nothing. Her hands checked a rifle that would be useless within minutes. She tied her hair tighter. She filed away the layout of faces around her. The simulation dropped. Wind hit like a hungry hand, full of grit. The sky revealed itself as a bruise swollen over a broken desert. Towers of glass and bone jutted from dunes like the spines of a gargantuan fish. The heat was a lie, thin cold at first breath, a furnace by the third. Somewhere not far, artillery stitched the air with bright holes. "Move!" the Zarveth roared. His squad moved the way water moves downhill, following the path they had trained to follow. Mira moved with them, head down, steps economical, breath counted. Fine dust tried to line her throat, she swallowed it. 3 minutes into the run, the first cadet fell, knees in the sand, hands clawing at a mask that had fogged the way fear fogs glass. Mira dropped beside them, turned the mask a quarter twist, vented, lifted the chin with a touch that knew how to tilt ahead for breath. "In through the nose," she said softly. "Out through the mouth. Small, slow. The air is yours if you take it." The cadet's eyes, layered membranes fluttering, focused. Air found greedy lungs. Mira squeezed the glove and moved. Radiation spikes came as the terrain rose. Their decimeters chirped anxious birdsongs. The squad leader cursed. "No system runs this wide a spectrum," he snarled. "This is malfunction. Reset." "Conditions change," Mira said, not to him and not to the sky. Her mouth was dry. Her hands knew what to do. She saw the beacon half buried ahead, a dull cylinder caught in a dune's shadow, barely pulsing. She angled toward it while the squad leader argued with the simulation's indifferent gods. A drone came over the ridge, young metal, meant to be annoying rather than lethal. Mira put 3 shots into its optic and dragged the cylinder out of its shallow grave. It was heavier than theory. She slung it onto her shoulder and turned to find her team scattered across microclimates like a handful of beads spilled on hot stone. She walked through the wind like someone who has had the wind as a roommate for a long, awkward decade. The beacon hummed. She hummed back. When she reached the extraction point, the others were not yet there. She stood with one boot on old stone and watched the sky, counting heartbeats to keep time. The squad trickled in. 2 limped. 1 vomited neatly into a glove and sealed it. The leader arrived at last, disbelief lacquered into his scales. He stared at the beacon on her shoulder, his crest rising as if pulled by a string. You don't carry that alone." Mira blinked at him, slow human. "You can help next time." The walls of the chamber exhaled and returned them all to a clean, cold world of polished floors and applauding machines. They said it was a calibration error. They said she had benefited from random alignments. They said many things that sounded reassuring to people who had to sleep. She slept. Not because reassurance worked, but because sleep had always been a job done between storms. When the Academy offered zero visibility combat navigation, she took the map from the instructor with the silence of a carpenter accepting wood, and when the fog rose and the drones whispered, she moved like she had been born in whiteout, counting steps, listening to echoes. She set tripwires out of salvage and memory, made fire with batteries and anger, and when the fog thinned it revealed debris and a path. They called it instinct. They called it luck. A few called it something that tasted like a rumor in the mouth, Deathworlder. Admiral Threx watched her training feeds at night with his hands folded like the prayer a hard species makes without knowing, and the old integration of skepticism and fear inside him shifted like a tired glacier. Then the static from the dark turned into a scream. No one saw the Dominion arrive. The Dominion never arrived. It simply redefined what here meant. Satellites stopped telling the truth. The sky acquired black punctuation that was not there before, and those marks shed machines the way bad weather sheds rain. Sectors went quiet. The Union fleet spun and did not know which direction was forward anymore. On Virelian Prime, the Academy's emergency blues softened the corners of every corridor, and voices began to try not to shake. Evacuation orders sang like lullabies through the halls. Cadets queued with backpacks and practiced smiles. The transports flexed their engines and listened to the sky, trying not to panic early. Mira Holt was not in a queue. Threx found her in an armory that smelled of lubricant and unwashed fear, with parts spread on the floor in patterns that told stories. She was building a thing that had no right to be useful, a rifle balanced for a hand that shook, a coil tightened by superstition and torque. Cadet Holt, Threx said, the title held everything he had not said out loud. Ship's weight. She nudged a spring into place. For where? Out, he said. He wanted to say safety. The word stuck behind old crystals. She wiped her palm on her thigh. Dominion doesn't leave you alone because you step aside. It follows heat. It eats resolve. It teaches the people who run that running is a religion. You intend to defy orders. It wasn't a question. He was an admiral who had watched too many young ones do brave things shaped like stupidity, and too many old ones do safe things shaped like surrender. I intend to make the place I'm standing in a bad meal, she said. He did something then he had not done in years. He weighed a rule and found it too light against the weight of a face. He moved past her and opened a locker that had not been opened since the Academy had decided it would never again host a war. He lifted a case from the dark and placed it on the table. Inside were lever-thin rifles made by engineers who had expected to die, a bundle of ragged flags, a canteen that smelled like old jokes. He staged the weapons and looked at her flatly. If you fall out of formation, he said, fall toward me. They built a defense in hours that should have taken days. Students who had memorized test answers learned to memorize sightlines. Professors counted ammunition with hands that had last counted chalk. The Academy's ghost of a war plan woke and found new clothes. When the sky loosened its grip and machines began to fall, they were ready in the way people are ready when they do not wait for permission to exist. The first drones hit the upper skydocks like a rain of serrated sleet. Cadets died with their eyes open, surprise etched in them like a drawing that refuses to fade. The second wave tried the southern breach and met a dozen tripwires strung by a person who had grown up making joy out of junk. Mira moved along the barricades like a weather front. She taught a trio of scale-bright first years to change a power cell without losing their fingers. She carried a wounded avian whose wing had been shredded by shrapnel and sang badly into their ear until their eyes focused again. She climbed a tower raked by fire and reconnected a guttering beam with a strip of copper wire, and a prayer not addressed to anyone. Her squad leader from the simulation, Jorek, fought with a wordless intensity that made him look older. He watched her with the sidelong disbelief of someone who has seen a statue drink water. During a lull that was almost a hallucination, he asked, "How do you not break?" She drank lukewarm water that tasted like recycled fear. "You treat breaking like a task and schedule it after the work," she said. She ran her thumb over a ridge in her rifle's stock. "And you let the ones beside you be heavier than your reasons to quit." The Dominion did not so much attack as exist violently. Its drones moved like a thought that refuses to be distracted. They adjusted their algorithms the way rain adjusts to roofs. They learned patterns and punished them. They made heroes and erased them to make room for more. The academy lost gardens and libraries, and 3 classrooms where small species had learned their first mathematics. The glass canopy over the auditorium cracked down the center like a kind truth. Blue emergency light gave everything a stage's hush, as if the world were rehearsing despair. On the 3rd day, the east wall fell. The Dominion machines poured through, glittering like good knives. The barricades there were made from lecture benches and a section of the old tramway. Mira stood on the tram rail and shot until her rifle tried to become a heating element. She tossed it aside and lifted another. She slid on blood that had not yet decided which heir to be. She found the point where the enemy's line was too sure of itself, and put a bomb made from 3 coils and a handspan of twine exactly there. At dusk, Admiral Threk stood on the western parapet and looked at his enemies in their unnumbered quiet. He thought of a myth told to frighten children into sleeping and commanders into caution. He thought of a cadet who carried a beacon through simulation, whether like a farmer carries water. He found the calm channel that reached everywhere the academy still had a voice and opened it. "Listen," he said. His voice filled helmets and barracks and a ruined dining hall where someone had arranged ration bricks into a smile. "If you can hear me, you are not done. If you are not done, you are alive. If you are alive, you can insult the patterns of a machine. We will make their learning expensive." He cut the channel and watched Mira climb a collapsed spire as if it were a staircase built by an impatient god. The top of the spire had once held ceremonial lanterns. Beneath their mountings dwelled an ancient emergency transmitter, a backup to the backup. Its manual crank waited like a dare. The radiation up there would salt marrow. The breadth of sky would scour thought. She reached it and looked down once. He saw her face as a child sees their first storm, afraid, grateful, unwilling to go inside. She lifted both hands and turned the crank. The beacon woke. It was a soundless brightness that beat the idea of distance into a new shape. It named Virelian Prime in a language older than maps. It threaded through Dominion noise and Union This Is Fine and found a quiet frequency no one remembered to monitor anymore. It spoke an old human call that meant not save me but see me. The crank burned her fingers. She turned it anyway. She did not count seconds. She counted faces and gave each one 5 heartbeats. When she had given everyone she had ever loved a piece of her strength, she let the crank slow. She stood within a thin, angry wind and watched the sky catch the call like a rumor. She climbed down in a world that had already begun to answer differently. The answer did not arrive as cavalry. It arrived as hesitation. Dominion patterns stuttered. The smooth geometry of their assault acquired a tremor, then a pause. Drones began to make small, stupid choices. Not many, just enough to matter. Union reinforcements came, angels with dents. Their ships spilled blue flame and stubbornness. They did not save the academy. They made it possible for the academy to save itself. The fighting bent into new shapes. It became streets and corners, rooms and breaths. Mira fired and moved, the way human stories say wolves run, one foot then the other, with a purpose so simple it is a kind of music. Lost in the calculus of the larger war, victories happened because one person stepped when another fell. Threx found himself beside a young being whose species name he did not know, their fur slick with smoke, their eyes fixed on the place the next enemy would appear. He took the far angle and understood, with the sudden certainty that sometimes arrives like a knife to rope, that command was smaller than he'd thought and more sacred for it. By morning the academy was a map of ruin and stubbornness. They held the spire where the beacon still hummed. They held the infirmary where triage had turned into a choir. They held a bridge because someone had written hours on its rust with a finger grimy with gunpowder, and the word had stuck. The Dominion withdrew not because it was broken, but because something in its algorithms had met something it could not model, the cost of being alive and unwilling, multiplied across 1,000 acts that were small only if you measured them with the wrong ruler. When the last black machine lifted, hauling a shadow with it, a reign began. The gentle, humankind Virelian Prime manufactured to cool a city at the end of a long day. It fell through holes in the canopy and washed the ash into patterns that looked like language. Mira leaned against a wall that had become more hole than wall and drank the rain with her mouth open. Jorik came to stand beside her, a bandage crossing his chest like a sash made by a friend. He stared at the sky as if it owed him money. "We live," he said, and seemed surprised to hear it spoken. "For now," she said, and smiled without showing teeth. He flicked water from his crest. "What did your beacon call?" "Not who," she said. "What?" She wiped wet from her lashes. "A promise we made a long time ago that we would not go gentle into cold space." He did not understand the words, but understood the shape. He nodded as if listening to a song outside his hearing range, and found, to his irritation, that it comforted him. They buried the dead with their names if they had them, and with a story if they did not. The academy, which had long preferred neat rows, learned to love the unstraight line. Some cadets left after the transports returned, too full of ghosts for further study. Some stayed, their uniforms patched with thread that did not match. Mira slept for 20 hours, woke ravenous, and ate 3 ration bars that tasted vaguely of nostalgia and oil. She stood afterward on the parapet where Threx used to stand, and watched technicians patch the sky. The beacon still burned, quiet now, as if listening for the next thing. Union Command sent messages that made careful shapes around the word human. They asked Threx for reports that read like stories told to children who are smarter than the teller thinks. He wrote what he could and did not write the thing that mattered most. An old species had found its posture again. The answer to the beacon came not as a fleet, not at first, but as a trickle of signals like birds returning to a place they had loved before it was destroyed. Small boats with hard edges, freighters with weapons welded on like afterthoughts, ships wearing paint faded by suns other than these. Their broadcast names were half jokes and half prayers. Gallows humor, second breakfast, stubborn star, homeward ugly. Some carried people whose genomes had been braided with local oxygen long ago. Some carried faces that might have been drawn from a museum wall on old Earth. Some carried robots that swore they remembered summer. They slid into Virelian's orbit with an ease that felt like a kind of crying. Their captain spoke on open channels in a language that had been a dead tongue, and found it not only alive but eager to be spoken. They were not many. They were enough to make the stars less empty. Mira stood in the docking bay as the first of them bled atmosphere through a new scar. The hatch opened on a woman whose hair had made a treaty with gray and whose shoulders had learned the compromise between sadness and rest. She looked at Mira and for a time measured in lost cities said nothing. Then her mouth found the old word. "Kid," she said. Mira had not been anyone's kid in too long a time. The word landed like a blanket. She swallowed once and looked down as if something fragile had fallen and might break if she saw it. "Captain," she said, it was easier. The woman Captain Alara Webb of the Stubborn Star stepped onto Virelian's deck, breathed its polite air and laughed once. "Smells like someone tried to make it safe." She reached into her pocket and brought out a coin, worn smooth by worry and time. On one side, barely visible, the shape of a world no one had seen in the flesh for 1,000 years. She flicked it, caught it, slipped it into Mira's palm. "For the crank," she said. Mira closed her fingers around the coin and felt its warmth. Metal carries heat the way stories do. They talk not like saviors or like guests, but like cousins who have learned to make peace with not having seen each other since the last fire. They compared maps and ghosts. They set to work the way a species sets to work when the work is not optional. Threx watched them with the calm of someone who had been wrong and had made an apology to the universe without art. He stood beside Mira on the repaired parapet and said, "Myth is lazy. It likes to end stories where they should begin." She looked at the city, which was still a bit ugly in places and would be for a while. "We told ourselves bedtime lies," she said. "Then we outlived them," glanced sidelong. "You said your world is ash." "Mostly," she said. "Some shards of ocean where the pressure holds. Some seeds in vaults that forget to be walls and remember to be doors. Humans are good at losing what they love and then carrying its outline the way you carry the shape of a tool you use every day." She flexed her fingers. "Then we build a tool that fits the outline." He grunted a sound that on an Arthian meant agreement and on anyone else would have been a compliment. "The Dominion will return, of course." She smiled without joy. Bullies always love the second punch. She turned the coin in her hand, but they learned a new math. They thought cost was measured in units built in factories. We measured it in a room where we took turns cranking a thing that hurt. He looked at the coin. He had museums full of medals and none of them looked like that. Night fell with the careful precision of a repaired machine. Stars took their stations. The academy slept badly and woke stubborn. Dawn learned the new cracks in the city and found plants creeping toward them with green hands. Mira trained first years again, this time in corridors with scorch marks as teachers. She taught them to count by breath and by friend. She taught them to pack a wound the way you pack a bag for a trip you might not come back from, tight, with care. She taught them to make light with wire and will, to step into bad weather and keep a piece of themselves dry. Word slipped to other worlds. A place called Virelian had stood up and not been turned into a period at the end of a sentence no one wanted to read. Refugees came not for safety but for lessons. Commanders came, hoping to extract a doctrine from a day that had not respected doctrines. They learned they could keep only one thing, a refusal to quantify souls. There was a memorial service in the auditorium under a new glass that would always be less pure than the old. Threx read names. He did not hurry. He folded some names he could not pronounce around his mandibles gently, as if they were bird eggs he did not want to break. Mira stood at the back with others who had more scars than time, and listened to the shape of absence. When it ended, she did not leave. She walked to the center where the holostage had once lied to a class and stood there until the light learned her outline. She lifted the bullet from her satchel and set it on the floor like an altar stone. For a breath, the room forgot to be a room. It became a road. The bullet sat there, absurd and true, and said nothing about conquest and everything about intention. Footsteps approached. Captain Webb's, slow and not sorry for being slow. She stood beside Mira and looked down at the dull metal. "We used to be that," she said, with the wondering tone of someone meeting an ancestor and recognizing a laugh. Mira's voice was low. "Maybe we still are. We make a thing and throw it. It changes the world by punching a hole through it. Then when the hole is exactly the right size, we plant something there instead." Webb snorted softly. "Poet. I blame hunger." They went to the mess and ate soup everyone swore was made of hope and a root vegetable that did not exist yesterday. It tasted better than ration bars. They did not talk about the second punch. They knew where it would land. They had already planned the bandage. When the Dominion returned, it did so the way a bully learns, cautious, resentful, smarter in the wrong ways. It probed edges. It sent decoys and small knives. It tried to tempt pride into becoming a trench. Violin did not oblige. It answered with a choreography learned from the first day. Do the fundamentals like prayer and let ingenuity burst where it will. Mira did not climb the spire a second time. A younger cadet did, eyes bright with terror and songs they would sing later if later happened. Mira stood at the base and counted faces again, sharing the weight of the crank through a map of memory. The beacon sang. Ships arrived early this time, the homeward ugly dancing like a clumsy starfish between elegant Union cruisers, Captain Webb cursing happily into an open mic. The battle was shorter. It was not less costly because cost does not take orders, but it was payable. When it ended, the Dominion did not withdraw. It hesitated and recomputed and remained without advancing. That was enough for a day named Tuesday on old Earth and named We Are Not Done Yet on Violin. After, Mira walked through the city with her hands in her pockets like a person who belongs. She passed a small group of children drawing on a freshly patched wall with chalk scavenged from an old classroom. They drew ships shaped like whales and knives and dreams. One child, a little Arthian with mismatched plates, looked up, suspicious. You are the one who turned the crank. Mira stopped. I took my turn, she said. The child considered fairness. I will take mine when I am taller. Mira crouched to eye level. Make sure the handle fits your hand, she said. If it doesn't, you make a new handle or a new hand. The child nodded seriously, went back to drawing, sketched a crank with a handle that looked like a flower. Threx came to stand beside Mira the way a tree comes to stand beside a stone the wind cannot move. He looked at the drawings. His crystals softened. There is a petition to add a history requirement, he said. He managed not to smile until he finished the sentence. The cadets demanded it. Teach them to tell it without making themselves heroes, Mira said. She might have been speaking to him, she might have been speaking to the air. Make them tell it so it hurts the right places and heals the right ones. You will teach it, Threx said. She laughed once short. I still smell like smoke. Good, he said. The chalk will listen. He left her with the wall and the children and the broken city practicing mending. She drew a small circle with a line through it among the ships. It meant Earth on maps that old sailors used. It meant a promise to herself on maps she kept in her chest. At sunset, the auroras returned, shy and green, as if apologizing for being beautiful while the world was busy. The academy hummed with new routines. People slept. People did not sleep. People lay awake and listened to the building remember how to be a building. Mira climbed the repaired spire to its first platform and sat with her legs dangling into the air the way a kid dangles legs off a dock. She held the coin Captain Webb had given her and let the last heat of the day seep into it. The stars came on, late and unhurried, and she counted them without keeping number, because counting sometimes ruins a thing. She thought of myths, how they simplify, how they forgive or condemn too quickly, how they turn messy truths into statues that do not drink water. She thought of the time she had raised her hand in a room full of certainty, and said a word that moved like a weather front, human. She thought of the bullet under the auditorium's light, of the crank, of the child drawing a handle shaped like a flower. She thought of Jorek's new scar, and the way he touched it sometimes as if checking it hadn't left. She thought of Threx's voice when he said myth is lazy. She thought of Earth as a sound, not a place. A transmission ripple kissed the spire. It was nothing like an alarm. It was more like the sound a field makes when wind pushes it just right and all the stalks bow together. She tapped the coin against the railing exactly 3 times. It was a thing her grandmother had done when she wanted to sign her name on air. She did not know why, only that it fit. Below, in the city, laughter learned the way back to throats. Someone played a song badly on a borrowed instrument and was forgiven. Someone kissed someone else as if it were a way to repair masonry. Someone read to someone who could not sleep. Someone worked on a machine that would break again tomorrow and was content to give it one more day of function. The world behaved like a stubborn animal that loves its owner. Mira closed her eyes. In the dark behind them, she saw rain and a storm and a crank and a bullet and a ship with a name like a joke. She saw the face of the woman who had said kid and the chin of the child who had said when I am taller. She saw herself at the back of a lecture hall, raising a hand in a room that did not yet know how to make room, and she forgave the room and herself and the day. When she opened her eyes, the stars had not moved. They rarely do for a single person, but sometimes a person moves enough for many stars. The galaxy had learned something costly. It had learned that the word Deathworlder did not mean someone who loves death. It meant someone whose world had taught them that life is a job, and that the job is to show up when the weather is bad. It meant someone who will crank the thing because it needs cranking, and teach someone else to crank it better, and then step back not because they are done, but because they trust the line. It meant the story does not end where it is tidy. Ships would come and go. The Dominion would recalculate and try awkward new sins. The Academy would produce officers who had the softness to stop a bleeding and the hardness to say no to a machine. Some would die in useful places. Some would live in necessary ways. All of them would understand that endurance is not passive. It is an action verb that eats plans and makes new ones with the same mouth. Mira stood. She palmed the coin and tucked it in the small pocket near her heart. She placed her hand against the metal of the spire in a simple, old farewell to a day that had not killed her, and to a night that was willing to try again. She looked once at the place where the beacon lived, a small door with a big story behind it, and nodded as if to a person. She climbed down and walked into the city that waited for her, the way cities sometimes do when they decide a person is worth keeping alive. She passed under a new sign someone had painted in hurried, imperfect strokes over the gate. We don't leave. It was not a threat, it was a policy. On the street she found Threx arguing with a portable coffee machine. It insisted on brewing only perfect cups. He insisted on drinking something too bitter to be correct. They looked at each other, weighed the day, and did not speak of the next one. The coffee tasted like Victory's little brother. They drank it anyway. Sometime much later, in a chamber patched from rubble and intention, Admiral Threx delivered a lecture. The holostage rose and did not lie this time. It showed a biped with soft skin and stubborn eyes, and the room full of cadets did not laugh. He let the image stand there and said nothing for a long breath. Then, they claimed Deathworlders were myths. Threx began, and his voice was not a bell anymore but the weather after a storm. Until a human cadet raised her hand. A hand rose in the back, small, unafraid. Threx smiled without showing teeth. Permission granted, he said. Always. Outside, Virelian's auroras unfurled like flags made of forgiving light. Ships traced patient sigils in the upper air. Somewhere below, a child finished drawing a handle and satisfied with the shape when to find the crank it matched. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.